All right, so I told you this only really is going to apply to probably one person here, but I'm going to preach it as though there's a whole bunch of young men. How about that? So I'm going to show you, because I told you about the who qualifies as a child and who qualifies as a young man. Let's look at a couple scriptures just for kind of a background on this. On one hand, a child could just mean somebody who is, has a mother, right? So you think about here's an example of the children of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean they were all babies, but they were just they're referred to as children. There's a place in the Bible even talks about Jesus, and it calls him the Holy Child. I don't think it's talking about whenever he was a baby necessarily. I guess could be reference to that, but the idea is just that they're a child. Remember one time on Facebook, and you guys might know my mom embarrasses me sometimes on Facebook. And on Facebook, my mom said something about my child and blah, blah, blah. I said, Mom, I'm 40 years old. She said, you're still my child. And I looked it up in the dictionary because I'm like, well, yeah, but all right, let's look it up. And sure enough, I'm still her child, right? So, so in one sense, I understand a child is a child. But often in the Bible, when it refers to the term child, especially when it's categorizing the different age groups and what have you, it's talking about a baby. And let's look at something here. Not a baby, but what we might call young men, but it's talking about even teenagers can be considered a child. Let's look at Genesis 17. Genesis 17. We recently read the story of Ishmael. In verse 25, it says, and Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. So he's telling the story here, and he's talking about Ishmael, and he says he's 13 years old. We know that a year goes by before Isaac is born, and after Isaac is born, it begins to tell the story. You remember the Hagar, the bondwoman, is cast out, and she takes her son Ishmael with her. And you read that context, and it looks like she's got a little child, like she's carrying a little child, and she casts him into the shrub, whatever. But that's not the case. It's talking about Ishmael, and it calls him a child. And so when you read it, you think about a little baby. But actually, he was 14 years old. Look at the story about Joseph, Genesis 37. Just a little bit of background, nothing important here, but Genesis 37. In verse 2, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, and with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father an evil report. So it talks about the lad there, and it talks about him as though he's a child in the context as you keep on reading. And so in my mind, as a kid, when I heard that story, I always thought he was a little kid. But it says there he's 17 years old. And so you read these stories and you say, well, then what exactly is a child? And here this evening we're going to talk about the young man. Well, what age group are you talking about? And so let's look at a place where it talks about a young man. Chapter 34, Genesis 34. And of course, there's tons of places we can go for all of these definitions. But here we read a story, and I won't get into all the background, but we read a story about Shechem. Okay, in 34, verse 19. And the young man deferred not to do the thing because he had delight in Jacob's daughter, and he was more honorable than all the house of his father. If you remember the story, Shechem was wanting to get married to her. And so you see, here's a guy called a young man, and he's obviously of an age where he can marry, and he's interested in starting be the head of his own household, and his dad is trying to get the bride for him and what have you. So this evening, as I talk about, it's not going to be a very long message here, but as I talk about this age group, I'm just going to generalize. And I'm going to say we're talking about a young man being somebody who's 19, 20, somewhere around that area. And I would say even all the way up to somebody who is of an age where they have raised kids, or they're of an age where they could have raised kids, and maybe even gone on to be a grandparent. It's hard for me to imagine, but I'm of an age where I could be a grandparent right now. I'm glad I'm not. We can wait a little while on that, but I'm of that age, being 40, and so that for this lesson, for this message, I'm going to put myself in the category of the age of men for this lesson, okay? And what we're talking about are these young men. Now, here's something that one day I was researching this, or the thought just kind of came to me, and it blew my mind. And we were at like a camp or something, and I think I say the thought came to me, okay, a preacher was making this point, and it just stuck out in my head. He's had everybody stand up that was of that age that I'm talking about, 19, 20, somewhere around that. That'd be the oldest people at the camp that we go to for the senior camp, maybe 19, 20 years old. And he was talking about the fact that these were the ones who are running the military. I mean, not running the military, but are joining the military. I probably don't have to tell you, I'm too old to join the military right now. Now, there are guys my age that might fight in battle. They might be of a rank or something where they could do that. But if we go into a major war, it's guys his age that are running things. That's a little scary to me. Not because I don't trust him or think he's a good kid, or some of these other 19, 20-year-old kids, but when I think about how young that is. Now, I realize when I was that age, I thought I was old. But now I look at that and think, whoa, that's something. My whole life I wanted to be a professional baseball player. At 40 years old, you think I could walk on a professional baseball team now? I know there was a guy that did it in his 30s. I watched the movie, The Rookie, about this guy, and it's a true story where he walked on and tried out, and he was able to play for a couple years. But let's be honest, there's a generation that has done their work, and now they're maybe leading in another way, but they're kind of slowly moving off the scene, and then there's a generation that's coming up, and they're taking over. And that scares me. Businesses out there are turning their businesses over to this younger generation. I don't want to mention any names, but have you went to any fast food restaurants lately? Have you been to so many businesses now that are grocery stores, what have you? Again, not mentioning any names, but I go there that they're being ran by these younger generations, and I'm thinking, what happened? I don't want to be too critical. I want to have some patience, and this is one of the things when we talk to the aged men, we said, hey, we got to be patient. We got to allow the younger generation to make some mistakes, because we certainly made mistakes and are still making mistakes, and so we have to understand that. I'm not trying to just criticize and say, hey, they ought to be, perfect by now. I understand that there's mistakes being made, but this younger generation, I'm kind of scared sometimes about where they are. And so, when it comes to the workforce, or it comes to representing our country, I think the Bible gives us some things that the young men need to put into perspective, some priorities in their life, and some things they need to work on that will allow them to take this place. But most importantly, to me, would be the future of our church, right? The future of the work of the ministry that God has called. Now, I'm not saying by this, and I'll probably say this several times, I'm not saying that every young man has to join the ministry. They have to be full-time ministry worker. That would be actually problematic. Everybody just wanting to be in the ministry. Who's gonna work the 40-hour job, doing whatever, So. And I'll say this about Zachary. I'm trying not to get too much personal, because I realize he's the only one in that age group tonight. But I'll say this about him. He told me before, he said, I don't think that God's called me to be a preacher or a pastor or anything like that. He said, but I want to be a hard worker. I want to do, whatever God would have me do, but then I want to be faithful to church and just help inside the church, be a lay person in the church is what he's talking about. And he said, he doesn't at this point in his life necessarily feel like God would use him to be a pastor. Well, I'm going to say this, again, it'll probably come up again in the message, but every young man, I believe, in terms of the future of our church and what have you, I believe they ought to keep themselves qualified to be a pastor, qualified to be a full-time worker. That doesn't mean God's going to use them for that, but they ought to not disqualify themselves, if that makes sense. As we look at the qualifications for a pastor and what have you, because you never know when God's going to use you. And those qualifications are given for a reason. These are men who could be, in fact, the qualifications for a deacon is very similar to that of an elder pastor. And so they ought to be, keep themselves spotless, keep themselves blameless, keep themselves of a good behavior, and not and learning how to rule your household, and learning how to do things well and take care of your business, and all these things, because you never know how God's going to use you. But you don't want to mess it up to where you can't be used of God, okay? Let's look at our text then, Titus chapter 2. We won't read the whole thing. We'll just read the part that pertains to the young men. Titus chapter 2, verse 6. Young men likewise. Now, it's funny, you see, likewise, it's the aged women likewise, the young men likewise. You know why? Because a lot of these things are repeated. They all talk about having a sound mind of some sort. Young men likewise exhort to be sober-minded. In all things, showing thyself a pattern of good works. In doctrine, showing uncorruptness, gravity, sincerity, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that he that is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to say of you. So let's look at these. I already mentioned them a little bit, but in terms of representing your country, in terms of the workforce, and in terms of the future of the church, let's think about these things in relationship to our young men. There are guys his age that represent our country, and they go off to war. They leave home. They go off to boot camp. They go off to these places. But not even just that. The Olympics. There are guys his age competing in the Olympics. Professional athletes. And you say, well, yeah, but that's not even important. I agree, actually. I don't agree. I don't think that sports is the most important thing in the world. I enjoy playing them. I don't so much enjoy watching them, to be honest with you. But I do enjoy playing them. I think there's a place for sports in our society, in our country even. And I like the Olympic Games. I think that's pretty neat. You know, everybody sends the best of their country to compete and all that. That's great. You know what I hate? Every year when the Olympics happens, some bozo from the United States is going to go over to a foreign country, get themselves in trouble, and mar the name of the United States all over the world. It happens every single time there's an Olympic Games. I don't even remember what this last one was, but they did some vandalism or something like that, and then they got to make this public apology, and you know that they're only apologizing because they got caught, and they want to be able to continue in the Olympics, and they got to do this. Or some guy decides, hey, I want to really be good for my country, and so I'm going to take illegal drugs. That'll help boost my performance, and they get caught, you know. I know it happens in other countries too, but I'm a citizen of the United States, and so when they go over there, I feel like they're representing me, and when they do that, I'm just like, not even proud. I'm not even, I'm proud to be an American, but not now, you know, not with that happening. We've got to keep ourselves soldiers. I remember the first thing that went through my mind in terms of soldiers is, you remember Desert Storm? And I won't even get into the details, but I ended up having all these pictures posted all over social media and all over the news about these young guys and girls over there supposed to be at war for our country. And they're doing stupid things and getting in trouble. I don't know if you remember some of the things that happened, but man, it's so embarrassing. And you don't think the rest of the world, and I know the rest of the world has their problems. A lot of them are pagans, a lot of them worshiping false gods, and a lot of them do plenty of evil, wicked stuff. But you don't think that they look at America and say, that's what those Americans do. That's how silly those Americans are. And, you know, granted, there's a young generation all over the world that wants to be like the United States young men and young women. I don't understand it, but they see all this bad stuff. You say, you know, now look, I'm not trying to just dwell on all the negative, but here's what I want to do. I want to encourage the young people to think about those people who they're representing. And if you're going to represent your country, you need to be somebody who has a sober mind. You're in control of your emotions and your desires and your thoughts. You ought to be somebody who can curb your appetite a little bit. These guys go over there, they're away from home now. They feel like they're big stuff, and here they are supposed to be representing the country. And what do? Boy, they just party. They drink a lot of alcohol, they get into trouble, lots of fornication, and they mess up real bad. They mar their testimony, they mar the testimony of others. We ought to be of a sober mind and be in control of our emotions and our desires. Young men, we all ought to, but I'm saying young men, I'm challenging you to do this and think about your future. You ought to show a pattern of good works. Yeah. Laziness is kind of something that defines young men in our generation, in this upcoming generation. Laziness. Don't be lazy. Have a good work ethic. Work hard. Make sure you're doing good works that matter, works that are going to be good and profitable. This is not a jab at my kids, although I know that they play video games. But I don't care how many hours you spent beating the bad guy on your video game. That's a work, that's hard work. But that's not a work that's going to matter. That's not a good work. You need to build something. You need to, I'm talking about not on a computer game. I'm saying you need to build something in real life. You need to have a good work ethic. And it needs to become a pattern. You know, my youngest son, here I am being personal again. My youngest son is now getting to a point where I'm saying, okay, you know, my oldest son, he's helping me at the church and he's doing all this. Now it's your turn to start mowing the yard. You know, to start doing some of these chores, taking the trash out to the road, making sure it gets done. And I'm telling you, going from a place where maybe that wasn't a regular activity to now, hey, I've got to mow the whole yard, and it just becomes a chore, and it becomes a hard job. Yeah, well, it doesn't ever start easy. No work starts out easy. It takes dedication and hard work. I remember my first hard-working job was at UPS, loading trucks. About 5 hours a night loading these, you know, probably on an average 70-pound packages just for just 5 hours, almost straight. And I remember after a couple weeks thinking, and this is what most do, this is why the turnover rate at that time, I think some things have changed now, but at that time it was just hard. They were just like slave drivers. I mean, we were reading this morning about the children of Israel in Egypt with the taskmasters. I mean, it seemed like that sometimes at UPS. And I'd work hard, and it was like a sweatshop, man. It's like, you know, there was no air conditioning in there. You're working in them trailers in the middle of the summer, just sweating all over the place, loading the boxes. And I remember thinking after a couple weeks, I think I'm in pretty good shape, but I can't do this. I can't perform to the level that they want. And I remember going to my dad and saying, Dad, this is just too hard work. I want to do it, but I feel like I can't. I feel like I'm a failure, and they keep wanting to get more out of me. And I remember him kind of laughing like, so? I mean, not that he didn't care, but he's like, that's what work is. You're gonna have that the rest of your life. People trying to get more out of you. You're just going to have to do it. The best that you can, you know. And so I remember going back to work, working hard. It wasn't long before, hey, this isn't so hard for me anymore. It became a pattern. And I'm throwing them boxes up, and You didn't hear that, but yeah, they throw packages at UPS. And I'm putting them all on there and getting them. And it wasn't long before someone said, hey, we need a guy to be a supervisor on the job. What do you think about running your own belt? You had about, I don't remember, maybe 9, 10 trailers, and being a supervisor. And I thought, what an honor. No, it wasn't an honor. It was just a glorified servant. But no, it was in my mind, you know what I did as a 18-year-old kid? It said, wow, if I work hard at something in life, and I prove that I got a good work ethic, and I can just get in there and do it even whenever it's hard, not complain to the bosses and not complain about the workload, and I just do it. Guess what? It's going to move me up in this world. And so I worked hard, and I ended up being a supervisor for a long time. In fact, at one part, this is I'm starting to feel old now. Because this is what old people do. I used to work when I was your age, 5 jobs, and I used to do this, and I used to go back and forth. But I remember one time having 3 jobs. I worked at my very first job. Sorry, here I'm getting old, I know, but my very first job was at daycare, actually, La Petite Academy. Just watching kids and trying to teach them and occupy their time until their parents come and pick them up. That's pretty much it. I'd get out of high school and I'd go over there and I'd do that, okay? Well, I left that job. I didn't leave the job, but I started another job and had to cut back on my hours at La Petite. I'm still in school, by the way, at this time. And I worked at Burlington Coat Factory because a job opened up. I said, well, I can make a little bit more money out there. But my parents had instilled in me a work ethic that said not to quit. I mean, my dad literally, that was, of course, he's a Marine, and he would say, hey, that vocabulary is not allowed in our house. You can't say I can't. You can't say that I quit. That's just not allowed. If you're gonna start something, you're gonna finish it. And so I had a hard time quitting. So I was working at Burlington Coat Factory, and then whenever they were hurting for somebody, La Petite would call me up and say, hey, can you come? Oh, sure, I can do that. And that was my last year of school. So then I finished up high school, started at UPS. UPS was overnight. So I work overnight. I get up in the morning and I'd go to La Petite for a couple hours and watch the kids, and then I'd go over to Burlington Coat Factory. Finally, I gave all that up and just kept the one job. But I remember this work ethic was instilled that I just got to work hard. I got to just keep going. I can't stop. That's missing in today's younger generation that's raising up. It's missing in most guys my age, really. And it's even getting worse, I feel like, with the younger generation. They just don't know how to work. They don't want to work, And that's a dangerous thing. Who's going to represent our country? Who's going to work in our workforce? Don't be lazy. Don't be just establish a pattern of good work. But particularly in my heart is this idea. We need men who are ready to take over the church, if you will. Not take over in a bad connotation, but who will step up and be the next men that will preach and teach the Bible. The next men that will be able to go out door knocking and winning souls. And look, you don't have to be a full-time worker. I understand that. You don't have to be a pastor. You don't have to be. But we need young men who will say, you know what, I'm going to start memorizing the Bible. I'm going to start learning how to teach the Bible, how to communicate the Bible with people. And I'm just going to develop a prayer life where I can keep in good communication with the Lord. And I'm going to develop a work ethic that says, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to do some work for the Lord. I'm going to memorize Scripture. It's not easy. That's hard work. But we need our young people to establish a pattern of good works, memorizing your Bible, communicating truths. We need young people that will continue attending services. That sounds so basic and so elementary, but I had teenagers in the youth group that kept falling, kept living poorly. You know what I mean? And they'd come and they'd say, "Oh, I messed up again," and I'd go over and over and I'd say, "Man, God's going to forgive you. I know He's a forgiving God. He's long-suffering. You keep coming back. He's going to forgive you. But look, you're messing up your life, and you're doing all this." And they said, "I know, Brother Rocky. I know I'm making mistakes. I know I'm messing up my life. I know I'm addicted to this and that. but one thing, I'm going to keep going to church. I said, no, you're not. Not if you keep flip-flopping. You're not going to keep going to church. You watch, I'm going to keep coming to church. So they'd keep coming, even though they weren't in their own life at home and what have you. They weren't representing Christ at all, but they kept attending services now and then. I mean, not all the time, but now and then. Slowly start fading out. They get their driver's license or they get a job. No, they don't have time for church anymore. And so now I go door knocking and these guys in their 20s, 30s, man or woman, doesn't matter. Oh, I'm just too busy. I got too much on my plate. I got to work. I got to go. I got to pay the bills. I got to do this. I don't have time for church. And I'm thinking, you don't have time not to go to church. Again, this was back, this is coming from a guy who was taught to have a good work ethic. Yes, go to school. Yes, work your job. But you still got to go to church. Well, what about my baseball practice? I got to go to baseball practice. Not if it's during church time. We don't have a generation that teaches that anymore. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't go because my school is having this activity during church, or my sports team has got to practice during church. Somebody's got to stand up and say, sorry, I can't do both, but I got to put God over my recreation. So we need some young men that will do that. But I fear we have a group of young men that are coming up, and children are watching them and kind of following in their footsteps. And they're just not really what we want to leave our businesses to. They're not what we want to leave our churches to. They're not what we want to leave the ministry to. But we need some young men that would do that. And I think that this is a challenge here in the book of Titus, and all throughout the Bible, there's challenges to it. Look at Proverbs 23. All right, Proverbs 23. That's not it. I hate when that happens, but. Do you remember the, I know what it is. Okay, hold on. I don't know. Somebody help me out. Landmarks. It says, I just have to quote it. Remove not the ancient landmarks that your fathers. It's one verse. I don't know how I messed it up. But while I'm waiting for someone, everyone's looking for it. Is it 23:19? Let's see here. No, that's not it. Proverbs. Somebody's got a smartphone. They can look it up. But do you remember whenever, she'll look it up and find it real quick. Do you remember whenever Rehoboam, the king, was put into position? And what did he do? He went to the old men that were in charge, that were running things. And he said, what do you think I should do? And so they gave him his advice. I won't even get in all the details, but they gave him his advice. And he said, okay, I'll think about that. Then he went with the young men in the council, and he said, what's your advice? Their advice was opposite from the old men. And he went with the young men's advice. Now, look, I'm not saying all of our older men out here in the world are people that we need to take advice from or that we need to follow after. But this is something I want to encourage our young men is this. You need to listen to the older generation. You need to have respect for that older generation and take into consideration what their words of wisdom. All right, and this verse is a good verse. 23:10. How did I get 28? No. Proverbs 23:10 says this. Remove not the old landmark and enter not into the fields of the fatherless. Okay, remove not the old landmark I think there's another verse that says the same thing, but here's the idea. Now we have fences, barbed wire fences and what have you to mark our land. And they used to have what was called a landmark, and it was made out of, this is the way I understand it. I could be wrong, but this is the way I understand it. And they would set stones. I actually see that sometimes still on fields today. There'll be these the sandstones, and they'll stack them on top of each other, and you'll have this kind of wall going. But they had these stones, and it marked their land. It was their landmark, okay? Well, if you wanted to, steal somebody's land, all you got to do is move that landmark, okay? Now, you wouldn't move it like hundreds of feet. It would be obvious. So you'd just kind of move it just a little bit. They wouldn't even notice that you moved the landmark, but really it's moved, It's gotten smaller and smaller. You go back later, move it again or whatever. And that's the kind of stuff that people would do, moving the landmark. Well, one of these, this verse is used oftentimes in the ministry to to tell the younger kids, hey, we need not to remove the landmarks that our fathers put into place, okay? And this is probably, I don't want to say more important because all those things are super important. Work ethic, you got to have work ethic. You got to have all these things, sober mind and what have you. But one of my biggest fears as I'm watching kids who graduate from Bible college, and I'm watching guys that are interested in ministry, but they're young and they're coming up with these new ideas in their head, and they're saying, "Hey, I want to get on board with this group of people, and here's what they're doing." One of the things I'm seeing is that what they're doing is they're moving their father's landmarks. Just today, as I'm kind of preparing for this lesson, and before I was putting my final touches on the message, if you will, somebody on Facebook said something about the school that they went to was no longer, they were hiring men that didn't use the King James Version, for instance. And I said, yeah, I went to a school that did that as well. They claimed to be King James only, but then the professors started coming in here that were ESV and they're NIV and what have you, and the college said, hey, we're not Calvinistic in our beliefs, but then they started having professors come in here that taught Calvinism. Before long, it was kind of coming in, and so the point that I was making in this conversation that we were having online was that that happens, and I fear what's happening is the old landmarks are being moved. People that were once say, I'm just going to stick with the King James. It's been, it's done us good for a long time. A younger generation is kind of laughing at that and saying, oh, you're so old-fashioned. We need to get a new book. We need to update that and revise it a little bit. And so I mentioned that, and I said, I think that the landmark's being moved. And this guy said, where in the Bible do you find that the King James Bible is a landmark? Well, that's circular reasoning that people always bring up. No, I can't find in the King James Bible where the King James is the only Bible, okay? But here's what I said. A landmark isn't something that God necessarily put even around the property. If you look at it, what's it talking about? Landmarks that your fathers put there, okay? Now, God is first. God's words and the principles of God that He's established, those take precedence over all else. I understand that. But you don't have to just every little thing be spelled out in the Bible. Your parents and your forefathers, their parents and their parents' parents and their parents, they've put some things in place. They've put some guidelines. They've put some, like a fence, if you will, around and said, here's going to be the guidelines. Here's going to be where our property, ends. This is the ending point of the property. There's no reason to just start moving that stuff. Say, well, I think it'll look better this way. I think it would be better to change this a little bit. Here's the advice I want to leave you with for all of our many young men that are here tonight. Don't get to a point where you say, okay, now I'm the head of my own household. And here's the thing. This is something I will say to my son. When you are the head of your own household, you leave the house, you got a wife and children, whatever they get, you are in charge of your own house. Okay, I'm no longer in charge. You do what you want to do. I mean, I might not like everything. I'm setting up already for times where, but you're in charge of your own household. But don't just think, well, now I'm in charge of my own household. I got to do and pull a Rehoboam. You know what I mean? Don't just get to this point where you say, let me see what do I think is best here, and just disregard everything that your forefathers have put into place. And I'm seeing that in our churches today, where this younger generation is coming up. Good hearts. Some of them want to serve the Lord. Some of them love the Lord. But they're changing so many things that were put there for a reason, and you might not even completely understand it. And I'm not saying that you have to do things, like I said, just because they've always been done that way or whatever. I remember that old illustration where this lady kept, every time she served, I think it was her meat, her turkey. You heard that. Okay, illustration number 5. You remember that one? Every time she served her turkey, she'd cut the ends of it off. I might be messing up the story a little bit. And so her daughter grew up, and Mom always did it this way, so she'd make the turkey and she'd cut the ends of it off. And so one day her children came up and said, all right, so now whenever you make this turkey, and then here's what I do. I cut this end off. I cut that end off. And she said, well, why do you do that? She said, I don't know. My mom always did it. Let's go ask my mom. Went and asked the mom, Mom, why do you cut the ends off like that? I don't know. My mom did it. Let's go ask her. Why do you cut the ends off? Because my oven was too small. So I'm not saying that we just need to do things because they've always been done that way. Maybe we don't even understand why they did it that way. But don't just disregard it just because your parents put this lamb on. And you say, well, I don't understand that. That seems like a weird rule. You know, I don't understand why we always sing songs from this old book, and some of these songs, they don't even really make sense. We don't use words like that. And I don't know why we have to use the King James Version. Well, if you don't understand it, but you don't understand why it needs to be changed either, just stick with it, okay? It's what your forefathers put into place. They put it there for a reason. You don't have to be ugly about doing it or say that everybody else is wrong and wicked, but but stick within those landmarks that your forefathers set. For the sake of our country, for the sake of the future of our jobs and our workforce, and for the sake of our churches and our church families, we need young men that are willing to step up, willing to have a sound mind and have a good work ethic, and to, I left this part out of it, but we're going to close anyway, not to be corrupted by the influences of those around you and what have you. We need men that would be sound of their speech and sound in doctrine, and that would not remove the old landmarks that their fathers set, unless they would need to be removed, because of God's word. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you.